Stay where you are, son. The voice was calm, controlled, but it carried across the entire street like something heavier than authority, something final. Ethan Carter froze halfway down his front steps, one worn sneaker hovering just above the cracked concrete. Across the narrow suburban road, lined with modest one-story homes and patchy lawns, neighbors had already gathered in clusters, their phones raised, whispers spreading like wind through dry leaves. 50 Marines stood in formation outside his house, their uniforms crisp, their posture unbreakable, boots aligned with mechanical precision as if the ground itself had been measured for them. The late afternoon sun reflected off windshields and metal insignias, casting sharp glints of light that made the entire scene feel unreal, like something pulled from a news broadcast instead of a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides as he tried to make sense of the moment. His mother stood behind him near the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other pressed against her chest, her breathing shallow, uncertain whether to step forward or disappear entirely. A low hum of engines filled the air, 3 dark military vehicles idling at the curb, their presence heavy, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The man who had spoken stepped forward from the line, his uniform marked with the insignia of rank, his movements precise but not aggressive, measured like someone who had spent a lifetime choosing control over chaos. He stopped a few feet from Ethan, studying him with eyes that didn't carry anger, but something deeper, something searching. "Ethan Carter?" the man asked, his voice quieter now, but somehow more intense. Ethan nodded slowly, barely able to find his voice. "Yes, sir." The word slipped out automatically, shaped by instinct rather than thought. The officer glanced briefly at the house, then back at Ethan, as if confirming something only he understood. Around them, the neighborhood had gone completely still. No lawnmowers, no passing cars. Even the distant sound of a barking dog had faded into silence, replaced by the collective tension of dozens of held breaths. Ethan's mind raced, flipping through every possible mistake he could have made, every small decision that might have led to this moment. Late shifts at the grocery store, skipping class once last month, that one argument with a customer. None of it made sense. None of it explained. This. The officer took another step closer, close enough now that Ethan could see the faint lines around his eyes, the kind carved by years, not anger. "I need you to think carefully," the man said, his tone steady, almost gentle despite everything surrounding them. "Where did you meet her?" The question landed heavier than anything else, cutting through the confusion, anchoring itself somewhere deep in Ethan's chest. Her. The word echoed, pulling something forward, something recent, something he hadn't thought would matter to anyone but him. His gaze flickered, just for a second, and in that second, something shifted in the officer's expression, not surprise, not relief, but recognition. And for the first time since the Marines arrived, Ethan felt it. Not fear, not exactly, but the quiet, creeping realization that whatever this was, it wasn't about what he had done wrong. It was about something he had done right. The words stayed in the air between them, quiet but heavy, and Ethan felt his chest tighten as the memory began to surface, not all at once but in fragments, like pieces of something he had not realized mattered until now. The officer did not rush him, did not raise his voice, he simply waited, and somehow that made it harder to breathe, harder to think, because there was no accusation in his eyes, only expectation. Ethan shifted his weight on the step, the concrete still warm beneath his shoe, from the late afternoon sun, and for a moment he glanced back at his mother, who gave a small, uncertain nod, as if telling him to just tell the truth, whatever this was. He swallowed again and looked back at the officer, his voice low at first, almost unsure of itself. "I met her, by the bus stop, on Maple and 3rd. And the moment he said it, the scene came back with sharp clarity, the kind that carried sound and smell and cold all at once. It had been late, close to 9, the streetlights humming overhead, flickering just enough to make the shadows feel deeper than they should have been, and Ethan had just finished his shift at the grocery store, his hands still faintly smelling like cardboard and produce, his back tired from stacking shelves for hours, the kind of tired that settles into your bones but never quite shows on your face. The bus was running late. That night, as it often did, and most people had already gone, leaving the sidewalk nearly empty except for a few passing cars and the distant echo of music from somewhere down the block. That was when he noticed her, sitting at the far end of the bench, wrapped in a thin coat that looked too light for the dropping temperature, her hands tucked into her sleeves, her posture small but not broken, like someone who had learned how to take up less space without disappearing completely. Ethan had almost looked away, almost done what everyone else did, because it was easier, because it kept things simple, but something about the way she sat there, still and quiet while the world moved around her, made him pause. He remembered shifting the plastic bag in his hand, the one with the sandwich he had planned to eat on the bus, and for a second he hesitated, calculating, thinking about how hungry he actually was, how long it would be until he got home, how little things like that added up when you did not have much. Then he walked over anyway. "Ma'am," he had said, keeping his voice gentle, not too loud, not too soft, just enough to be heard without startling her. And she had looked up slowly, her eyes sharp despite everything else, not confused, not lost, just watchful. He had held out the sandwich, still wrapped, still warm from the store's heat lamps, and said, "You can have this." And for a moment she did not take it, did not even move, just studied him like she was trying to understand something deeper than the gesture itself. Then, finally, she accepted it with a small nod, her fingers brushing his for the briefest second, cold against his skin. Ethan blinked, pulled back slightly, and added, almost awkwardly, "It is still warm," as if that detail mattered more than anything else. She had not said thank you, not right away, but her eyes softened just a fraction, enough for him to notice, enough for it to stay with him long after the bus arrived and carried him home. Now, standing in front of 50 Marines, Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice steadier as he finished. "I just gave her some food." And the officer's gaze did not change, but something in the air shifted again, subtle, like a door opening, somewhere no one else could see. The officer did not interrupt him, did not write anything down, did not even glance back at the Marines behind him. He simply held Ethan's gaze for a long second that stretched just enough to feel deliberate. And then he asked quietly, "Once?" Ethan hesitated, the question catching him off guard, because it was not accusatory, it was precise, like the man already knew the answer and was giving him the space to say it out loud. Ethan shook his head slightly, his voice lower now, but steadier. "No, sir, not just once." And the memory shifted again, expanding, pulling him back into the rhythm of days that had started to blur together in the way small routines often do. The next evening had been colder, the kind of cold that slipped under your jacket no matter how tightly you zipped it. And Ethan had stepped off the bus with his hands tucked into his sleeves, his breath visible in short clouds as he walked past the same corner on Maple and 3rd, and there she was again, sitting in the exact same spot, as if she had not moved at all since the night before, her posture unchanged, her eyes following the street with quiet awareness. He had slowed without thinking, the plastic bag in his hand lighter than usual, because he had already decided, before even seeing her, that he would bring something again, something simple, something warm. "Evening," he had said this time, more natural, less hesitant, and she had looked up sooner, her gaze meeting his without that same distance as before, and when he offered the food, she accepted it with a small nod, still not speaking, but not refusing either. It became something unspoken after that, something that did not need explanation, just repetition. Each day after school, after work, after whatever shift or errand filled his time, Ethan would stop by that corner, sometimes with a sandwich, sometimes with a cup of hot soup from the deli, sometimes just a bottle of water and a granola bar when money was tight. And each time she would be there, always there, like the city had forgotten her, but she had not forgotten how to stay. People passed by them constantly, footsteps quick, eyes forward, conversations loud enough to fill the space without ever touching it. And sometimes Ethan could feel the looks, the brief glances that lingered just long enough to judge, but not long enough to understand. And once, a group of teenagers had slowed down, one of them lifting a phone, whispering something under his breath before letting out a quiet laugh, the kind meant to be heard but ignored, and Ethan had felt the heat rise in his face, not anger, not exactly, but something close to it, something uncomfortable, like being seen for the wrong reason. He had almost stopped going after that, almost told himself it was not his responsibility, that someone else would help, that the world had systems for things like this. But the next evening, he still found himself walking back to Maple and 3rd, still holding a small paper bag, still stopping at the same spot. One night, as the streetlight above flickered and the distant sound of a passing train rolled through the air, she finally spoke, her voice soft but clear, carrying a steadiness that did not match the rest of her appearance. "You come back," she said, not as a question, not as praise, just an observation, and Ethan had shrugged slightly, unsure what to say. "I pass by anyway," he replied, even though they both knew that was not entirely true. She studied him for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought, and then she added, "Most do not." And something about the way she said it settled deeper than he expected, not heavy, not sad, just real. Now, standing in front of the officer, Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction as he finished. "I just kept bringing her food." And this time, the officer gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that every word mattered more than Ethan had realized. The officer's nod was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight, the kind that shifted something in the air without anyone saying a word, and Ethan felt it, not fully understanding it, but sensing that whatever came next was no longer about suspicion, it was about something being confirmed. The officer glanced briefly over his shoulder, not turning fully, just enough for the Marines behind him to remain aware. Their formation still perfect, still silent, like they were part of something larger than the moment itself, and then his attention returned. To Ethan, sharper now, more focused. "How long?" he asked, his tone unchanged, but the question landed differently this time. Not casual, not passing, but exact, like a detail that mattered more than anything else Ethan had said so far. Ethan blinked, thinking, counting without numbers, measuring time in cold evenings and bus rides and paper bags that grew lighter each week. "About 2 weeks, he answered slowly. "Maybe a little more." And as soon as the words left his mouth, another memory surfaced, one that did not feel like the others, one that stood apart. It had been raining that night, not heavy, not enough to keep people inside, but steady, the kind that soaked through clothes over time, turning sidewalks slick and reflections blurry under streetlights. And Ethan had almost skipped going, almost convinced himself that no one would be out in weather like that it would be different, but something pulled him there anyway, something quiet and persistent. When he reached the corner, she was still there, sitting under the small metal awning that barely shielded anything, her coat darker from the damp, her hands still tucked into her sleeves, but this time her posture was slightly different, not smaller, but slower, like the cold had settled deeper. Ethan had stepped closer without saying anything at first, the paper cup in his hand warm against his fingers, steam curling into the cool air, and when she looked up, there was something new in her expression, not weakness, not exactly, but a kind of fatigue that went beyond the body. He handed her the cup, and this time she did not hesitate. She took it immediately, wrapping both hands around it, as if holding on to something more than just warmth. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the sound of rain tapping lightly against the metal roof filling the space between them. Then, quietly, she said, "You should not come out in this." Her voice softer than before, but steady, and Ethan had shrugged, shifting his weight slightly. "It is not that bad." Even though his jacket was already damp at the shoulders, she watched him for a moment, longer than usual, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was trying to place something. And then she added, "You keep choosing this." And the way she said it made it sound like more than a habit, more than a routine, like a decision he was making over and over again. Ethan had not answered right away, because he did not have a reason that sounded important enough, not something that would explain it in a way that made sense. So he simply said, "I just do." And for the first time, she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not wide, not bright, but real enough to change her entire face for a second before it faded again. Now, back in the present, Ethan shifted slightly on the step, the memory settling into place as he finished, even when it rained, and the officer's expression changed just a fraction, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else might notice, but enough for Ethan to feel it, like a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, and somewhere behind the officer, one of the Marines adjusted his stance ever so slightly. The faint sound of a boot against pavement breaking the stillness for just a moment before everything returned to silence again. The silence after Ethan's words did not feel empty anymore. It felt weighted, like every second was being measured against something unseen, and the officer drew in a slow breath, his gaze lowering just briefly before returning to Ethan's face with a clarity that had not been there before. 2 weeks, he repeated, not questioning, not doubting, just placing the detail where it belonged. And then he took a step back, a small one, but enough to shift the dynamic, enough for the line of Marines behind him to become more than background, more than presence, as if they were all part of the same answer that Ethan had not yet heard. Ethan stood still, his heartbeat steady but louder in his ears now, the kind of awareness that comes when something is about to change. And from the corner of his eye, he could see his neighbors leaning in slightly, their phones still raised, their curiosity no longer casual but sharpened, pulled tighter by the unfolding moment. The officer turned his head just slightly, giving a brief nod to someone behind him. And the movement was subtle, but it triggered something immediate. One of the Marines stepping forward from the formation with a controlled, deliberate pace, carrying something in his hands, not large, not dramatic, just a small, folded item wrapped in clear protective material. Ethan's eyes followed it instinctively, confusion flickering across his face as the Marine stopped a few feet away and extended it toward the officer, who accepted it without breaking rhythm. For a second, the officer looked down at it, his expression unreadable, and then he held it out toward Ethan. "Do you recognize this?" he asked quietly, and Ethan hesitated before reaching out, his fingers brushing the edge of the plastic, the surface cool and smooth against his skin. And when he lifted it slightly, turning it just enough to see what was inside, his breath caught. It was a small photograph, worn at the corners, the kind that had been handled many times, the image slightly faded but still clear enough to see. A younger version of the woman from the bus stop, her posture straighter, her coat clean, her eyes just as sharp, standing beside a man in uniform, his posture unmistakable, his presence strong even in stillness. Ethan blinked, his mind trying to reconcile the two images, the one in his hand and the one in his memory, the quiet figure under the streetlight and the composed woman in the photograph. And for a moment, he did not speak, because the connection felt too large to say out loud. The officer watched him carefully, not rushing, not explaining, just allowing the realization to form on its own. And when Ethan finally looked up, his voice was softer, almost uncertain. "That is her," he said, the words coming slower than expected, as if saying them made everything more real. The officer gave a slight nod, his expression shifting just enough to show that this was the answer he had been waiting for. And then, after a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice steady but carrying something deeper now, something that reached beyond the street, beyond the house, beyond the gathered crowd. "Her name is Eleanor Hayes," he said, and the way he said it gave the name weight, history, meaning, like it had been spoken in rooms far different from this one. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the photograph, his gaze dropping back to it for a second, and in that moment, the quiet routine of 2 weeks began to feel different, not smaller, but larger, like it had been part of something he had not seen. The officer took another breath, his posture straightening just a fraction. And though his tone remained controlled, there was something unmistakable in it now, something that carried both respect and gravity. "And for the last 14 days, he continued, you have been the only person who treated her like she was not invisible." And the words settled over the street, over the watching neighbors, over Ethan himself, heavier than any accusation could have been. And in the distance, one of the idling engines lowered its hum just slightly, as if even the machines understood that this moment required quiet. The name seemed to settle into Ethan's chest in a way he could not explain, heavier than a memory, quieter than a realization. And for a moment he just stood there holding the photograph, his fingers still, his thoughts catching up to something his instincts had already begun to understand. Eleanor Hayes, the woman from the corner, the one who sat beneath the flickering streetlight, the one who spoke in calm, measured sentences, the one who watched more than she asked, suddenly felt different. Not because she had changed, but because everything around her had. Ethan looked up slowly, his eyes searching the officer's face for something that could anchor this, something that made sense of why 50 Marines were standing outside his house for a woman who had no home at all. "I did not know," he said quietly, the words simple, honest, almost apologetic in a way he did not intend. The officer gave a slight nod, not dismissing the statement, but acknowledging it as part of the truth. "No," he replied, and there was no accusation in it, only certainty. The air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if the tension that had filled the street earlier was being replaced by something else, something more deliberate, more focused, and behind the officer, the line of Marines remained perfectly still, but their presence no longer felt like a wall, it felt like a witness. Ethan's grip on the photograph loosened slightly as he looked down at it again, tracing the outline of the woman's face with his eyes, comparing it to the image in his memory. The way her hands trembled slightly when the air grew colder. The way she held the cup of soup like it was something fragile, something to be protected. "Is she okay?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it before. He could measure whether it was the right thing to say in a moment like this. But it was the only thing that mattered to him now, the only part of the situation that felt real. The officer's expression softened just a fraction, not enough to break his composure, but enough to be seen if you were looking for it. And Ethan was. "She is safe," the officer said, his voice steady, carrying a quiet reassurance that settled over Ethan like warmth. And for the first time since the Marines had arrived, Ethan exhaled fully, his shoulders lowering just a little, the tension easing in a way he had not noticed building. The officer continued after a brief pause, his gaze steady. "We have been searching for her for months," he said, and the words carried weight, not just in their meaning, but in the time they represented, the effort, the absence, the quiet urgency that had existed long before this street, long before this moment. Ethan blinked, trying to place that timeline against his own, 2 weeks of small actions against months of searching, and the contrast felt almost unreal. "She never told me," Ethan said, more to himself than to anyone else, and the officer nodded again, this time with a hint of understanding. "She would not," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he knew her well, not just by name, but by nature. A brief silence followed, not empty, not awkward, but full, like a pause that allowed everything to settle into place. And then, the officer took a small step forward, closing the distance just slightly, his presence no longer distant, no longer formal in the same way. "What you did," he said, his voice lower now, more personal. "It mattered more than you think." And the words did not come with emphasis, did not need it, because the truth of them was already evident in everything surrounding them, in the formation behind him, in the vehicles at the curb, in the quiet attention of every person watching. Ethan did not respond right away, because there was nothing he could say that felt equal to that statement, nothing that matched the scale of what was unfolding. So he simply nodded once, slowly, the motion small but certain, and in that moment, the simple act of bringing food to a corner on Maple and 3rd no longer felt small at all. The words lingered in Ethan's mind long after the officer finished speaking, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that refused to fade. And for a moment he stood there holding the photograph, the edges pressing lightly against his fingers as if grounding him in the reality of it all. Across the street, someone shifted, a quiet murmur passing through the small crowd of neighbors. Their earlier curiosity now softened into something else, something closer to reflection, and a few phones slowly lowered, as if the moment had outgrown the need to be captured. Ethan glanced briefly toward them, then back at the officer, his thoughts still catching up, still rearranging everything he thought he understood about the past 2 weeks. "I was just helping," he said, his voice careful, not dismissing what had happened, but not claiming more than he felt was true. And the officer's expression changed again, just slightly, enough to show that he understood the simplicity of the statement and the weight behind it. "That is exactly why it matters," the officer replied, his tone calm, unwavering. And there was something in the way he said it that made the words settle deeper, like they carried meaning beyond the moment itself. The officer turned slightly then, not fully away from Ethan, but enough to gesture subtly toward the Marines behind him. And for the first time since they had arrived, the formation shifted, not breaking, not losing precision, but adjusting, as if the purpose of their presence had changed from arrival to acknowledgement. One of the Marines stepped forward again, this time without carrying anything, his movements deliberate, respectful, and he stopped a few feet behind the officer, standing at ease but still attentive, his gaze forward, his posture unwavering. Ethan watched the motion carefully, his breath steady now, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet awareness that something significant was unfolding, something that had nothing to do with mistakes or consequences, but everything to do with recognition. The officer turned back fully to Ethan, his shoulders squared but his presence no longer imposing in the same way. And after a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. "Eleanor Hayes served this country in ways most people will never know," he said, and the words did not come with pride alone, but with respect, with history, with something earned over time. Ethan blinked, absorbing that, placing it alongside the image of the woman he knew, the one who sat quietly under a streetlight, who held a cup of soup with both hands, who spoke in short, measured sentences, and the contrast did not feel like a contradiction. It felt like a missing piece finally being revealed. She chose not to be found. The officer continued, his gaze steady. But that does not mean she deserved to be forgotten. And the statement settled over the street with a quiet finality, one that seemed to reach beyond just Ethan, beyond the gathered neighbors, into something broader, something shared. Ethan looked down at the photograph one more time, his thumb brushing lightly against the plastic surface, and then he handed it back carefully, his movements deliberate, respectful in a way he had not fully intended but now understood. "I did not see her like that," he said quietly, not as a defense, not as an explanation, but as a simple truth, and the officer accepted the photograph with a small nod, his expression firm but not distant. "No," the officer said, his voice softer now. "You saw her the way she needed to be seen." And for a moment, nothing else moved. Not the Marines, not the neighbors, not even the quiet hum of the vehicles at the curb. As if the entire scene had paused just long enough to let that truth settle fully into place. And in that stillness, Ethan realized that the smallest choices, the ones made without expectation, without recognition, sometimes carried the weight of something far greater than anyone could see at the time. The stillness did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like the air itself was adjusting to something new, and Ethan felt it in the way his breathing settled, in the way his shoulders no longer felt tight, in the way the street, which had moments ago felt like a stage under harsh light, now felt quieter, almost intimate. The officer lowered his hand after taking the photograph back, holding it carefully, not as evidence, but as something personal, something that carried memory rather than proof, and for a brief second, his gaze dropped to it before lifting again to Ethan, steady and deliberate. "There is something else you should know," he said, and the tone of his voice shifted just slightly, not heavier, but deeper, as if the next part mattered in a different way. Ethan nodded without speaking, his attention fixed, his thoughts no longer racing but focused, ready in a way he had not expected to be. The officer took a small step to the side, just enough to open the space behind him, and one of the vehicles at the curb powered down completely, the low hum of the engine fading into silence, leaving only the distant sound of wind brushing through trees and the faint creak of someone shifting their weight on a porch nearby. The rear door of the vehicle opened slowly, not with urgency, not with spectacle, but with quiet intention, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, the entire street holding its breath without realizing it. Ethan's eyes followed the movement instinctively, his heartbeat steady but present, and as a figure began to emerge from the vehicle, his chest tightened slightly, not with fear, but with recognition that had not yet fully formed. The woman stepped out carefully, her movements slower than he remembered, her posture slightly more supported, but unmistakable, the same presence, the same quiet awareness in the way she looked around before her gaze settled forward. Eleanor Hayes stood there, no longer under a flickering streetlight, no longer wrapped in the isolation of a bus stop bench, but still entirely herself. Ethan blinked, the image aligning with memory in a way that felt almost unreal. the street, the Marines, the neighbors, all fading slightly in his awareness as he focused on her. She took a few steps forward, not rushed, not uncertain, just measured, and the Marines behind her remained still, their formation unchanged, but their presence now clearly protective, not imposing. When she reached a point just behind the officer, she paused, her eyes moving to Ethan, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them different now, not empty, not questioning, but full of something understood without words. Ethan shifted slightly on the step, his hands at his sides, unsure of what to do, unsure of what this moment required, and before he could decide, she spoke, her voice calm, steady, exactly as he remembered. "You came back," she said, the same words from the rain-soaked evening, but now carrying something more, something layered with time and awareness. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, not out of humor, but out of recognition. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice softer than before, more certain. She studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp but warm, and then she gave a slight nod, the kind that did not need explanation, the kind that acknowledged everything that had already happened without repeating it. The officer stepped back then, just one step, giving the space between them room to exist without structure, without rank, without formality. And in that space, the entire meaning of the past 2 weeks settled into something real, something visible, something no longer quiet or unseen. And for the first time since the Marines had arrived, Ethan understood that this moment was not about what had been discovered, but about what had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The moment held longer than either of them expected, not stretched, not forced, just allowed to exist in its own quiet rhythm. And Ethan noticed how everything around them seemed to fade slightly, not disappearing, but softening, like the world had stepped back to give space to something more important. Eleanor Hayes stood with her hands gently folded in front of her, her posture steadier now than it had been at the bus stop. Her coat clean, her presence no longer overlooked, and yet there was nothing distant about her, nothing that separated her from the woman Ethan had met under the streetlight. She took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough to feel personal, and her eyes never left his, sharp and aware, but carrying something warmer now, something that had not been there before. "You did not ask me anything," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, and Ethan blinked, the question catching him slightly off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was true in a way he had not considered. He shifted his weight, thinking for a moment before answering. "I did not think it mattered." And the simplicity of the response hung between them, honest, unpolished, exactly what it was. She studied him for a second longer, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already begun to understand, and when she spoke again, her tone softened just a fraction. "Most people need to know everything before they decide how to treat you," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only observation, the kind that came from experience rather than judgment. Ethan glanced down briefly, then back up, his brow tightening slightly as he processed that. "I just saw you needed food," he replied, and the words felt almost too small compared to everything surrounding them, but they were the truth, and that was enough. A faint sound of movement came from behind her as the officer shifted slightly, giving them space without stepping away entirely, his presence still there, still watchful, but no longer the center of the moment. Eleanor's gaze softened again, and for a brief second, something passed across her face that felt like both gratitude and something deeper, something harder to name. "You saw me," she said, more quietly now, and the difference in her words was subtle but unmistakable. Not about the food, not about the act, but about the recognition behind it. Ethan did not respond right away, because he was not sure how to, and in that silence, he became aware of the small details again. The way the wind brushed lightly against the trees lining the street, the faint creak of a porch step somewhere nearby, the distant hum of a car turning onto another block, all of it grounding the moment in something real, something present. Eleanor took a slow breath, her shoulders lifting just slightly before settling again, and then she spoke once more, her voice steady, clear. "I chose not to be found because I needed to know if kindness still existed without reason," she said, and the statement landed with quiet weight. Not dramatic, not heavy, but undeniable, and Ethan felt it settle into him in a way that made everything else make sense. The silence, the observation, the questions she never asked. He blinked, the realization forming slowly. "And did you?" he asked, his voice careful, almost unsure if he should. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she gave a small nod, the kind that did not need elaboration, the kind that carried its own answer fully. "Yes," she said simply, and in that single word, everything aligned. The past 2 weeks, the Marines, the photograph, the quiet routine that had never felt like anything more than a small choice repeated day after day. And for the first time, Ethan understood that what he had done was not just seen. It had been measured, not in scale, not in cost, but in something far more difficult to define, something that could not be forced, only revealed. And in the stillness that followed, the entire street seemed to hold that truth with them, without needing to say a word. The word lingered in the air long after she said it. Simple, steady, impossible to ignore, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere that did not need explanation. And for a moment he just stood there, unsure what to do with the weight of something that had never felt heavy before. Around them, the street remained quiet, but not in the same way as earlier, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, like every person watching had begun to understand that this was not about authority or consequence. It was about something far more human. The officer shifted his stance slightly, his posture still composed, but his presence no longer leading the moment. And after a brief pause, he stepped forward again, just enough to stand beside Eleanor rather than in front of her, his role no longer one of control, but of witness. "Mrs. Hayes has not spoken publicly in years," he said, his voice calm, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the gathered crowd, and a faint murmur passed through the neighbors again, softer this time, more restrained, as if they were careful not to disturb what was unfolding. Ethan glanced briefly at them, then back at the officer, his attention returning quickly, anchored by the gravity of what was being said. "She asked for one thing when we found her," the officer continued, his gaze steady. "She asked us to bring her to you." And the words landed with a quiet finality that shifted something inside Ethan, something that made his chest tighten slightly, not with fear, not with confusion, but with the realization that this moment had been intentional long before he understood it. Ethan blinked, his eyes moving from the officer to Eleanor, searching for confirmation, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, certain, and she gave a small nod, the kind that carried no doubt. "I needed to see you in your world," she said softly. Her voice measured, not elevated, but clear, enough to reach him without effort. "Not where I was, but where you are." And Ethan felt the meaning of that settle slowly. The idea that she had chosen to step into his space, not as someone above him, not as someone to be recognized, but as someone who wanted to understand what had already been shown. He shifted slightly, his hands still at his sides, unsure of what response this moment required, because nothing about it felt ordinary, nothing about it felt like something he had prepared for. And yet it felt real in a way that needed no preparation at all. "I did not do anything special," he said quietly, the words coming naturally, because they were true in the way he understood them. And Eleanor watched him for a moment, her eyes steady, her expression thoughtful, and then she took a small step closer, closing the space between them just enough to feel personal, to feel direct. "That is why it matters," she replied, echoing the officer's earlier words, but now carrying her own meaning, her own weight behind them. And Ethan felt it again, that same quiet shift, that same realization that what he had seen as small had been something far greater to someone else. Behind them, the Marines remained still, their presence no longer a question, no longer a statement, but a confirmation, a silent acknowledgement of something that could not be measured in rank or formation. The officer lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, his voice steady as he added, "You reminded her of something this world does not always show." And though he did not elaborate, he did not need to, because the meaning was already there, already understood. Ethan nodded slowly, not because he had all the answers, but because he no longer felt the need to have them. And in that moment, standing on the steps of his own home, surrounded by people who had come expecting something entirely different. He realized that the smallest actions, the ones done without recognition, without intention, beyond the moment itself, had the power to reach further than anyone could see. And in the quiet that followed, there was no applause, no movement, just a shared understanding that something simple had revealed something profound. The words settled over Ethan in a way that did not demand a response. They simply stayed quiet and steady, like something meant to be carried rather than answered. And for a moment he just stood there, feeling the weight of it not as pressure, but as clarity. Eleanor remained in front of him, her presence calm, grounded, her eyes still fixed on his with that same quiet awareness he had first noticed under the streetlight. And now that everything had been revealed, nothing about her felt different in the way that mattered most. She did not stand taller. She did not speak louder. She did not claim anything more than what had already been shown. And somehow that made everything around her feel more real, more certain. Ethan shifted slightly, his gaze dropping for a brief second before lifting again, his voice careful but sincere. "I would have done the same, no matter who you were." And the honesty in it carried no hesitation, no attempt to impress, just a simple truth that had guided him without needing explanation. Eleanor studied him for a moment longer, and then she gave a small, knowing nod, the kind that did not just acknowledge what he said, but confirmed something deeper, something she had already understood before this moment. "That is why I believed you would," she replied softly, and the words felt less like praise and more like recognition, like she was naming something that had always been there. A faint breeze moved through the street, rustling the leaves along the sidewalk, and somewhere behind them, one of the neighbors quietly lowered their phone. Completely, as if realizing that this was not something meant to be watched through a screen. The officer remained beside Eleanor, his posture steady, his presence now fully aligned with hers rather than leading. And after a brief pause, he reached into his jacket and removed a small, folded document, holding it carefully for a second before extending it toward Ethan. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a different kind of weight now, something more formal, more structured. And Ethan hesitated before reaching out, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper as he took it, unfolding it slowly. The page was official, printed, the kind of document that carried authority in its design alone. But Ethan's eyes moved past the formatting, past the insignia, searching for meaning in the words themselves. And as he read, his brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in surprise. It was not a warning, not a report, not anything he had expected. It was recognition, written in clear language, acknowledging an act that had never been intended to be seen, never been meant for anything beyond the moment it happened. Ethan looked up, his eyes moving between the officer and Eleanor, unsure of what to say, because the formality of it felt so different from the simplicity of what he had done. "I do not need this," he said, quietly, not rejecting it, but not fully understanding why it was necessary. And the officer gave a slight nod, as if he had expected that response. "It is not about need," he replied. "It is about making sure the world does not overlook what matters." And the statement carried a quiet conviction that settled into the space between them. Eleanor watched the exchange without interruption, her expression calm. But there was something in her eyes now, something softer, something that reflected not just understanding, but a kind of peace, as if the question she had carried had finally been answered. Ethan glanced back down at the paper, then folded it carefully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. And in that moment, standing on his own front steps, surrounded by people who had come expecting something entirely different, he realized that what he had done had never been about recognition, but somehow, it had still found its way to it. And in the quiet that followed, there was no need for anything more to be said. The paper felt lighter in Ethan's hands than it should have, considering everything it represented, and he held it for a moment longer before slipping it carefully into his jacket pocket, not out of obligation, but because it now carried a quiet meaning he did not want to lose. The street remained still, but the stillness had changed again, softer now, less like anticipation and more like resolution, as if the moment had reached something it had been building toward all along. Eleanor watched him with a calm expression, her posture relaxed but present, and for a second, she glanced around the neighborhood, taking in the small houses, the uneven sidewalks, the people standing quietly with their attention fixed on something they had not expected to witness today. "This is where you live," she said. Gently, not as a question, but as a statement that carried its own kind of understanding, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze following hers briefly before returning to her. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady, grounded in something that now felt more important than it had just hours ago. She took a slow breath, her shoulders rising slightly before settling again, and then she looked back at him, her eyes clear, focused, and for the first time, there was something in them that felt like quiet pride, not for herself, not for anything she had done, but for what she had found. "You did not change your behavior when no one was watching," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a depth that made them feel larger than the moment itself, and Ethan felt them settle into him in a way that made everything else fall into place. He shifted slightly, his hands relaxed at his sides. "I did not think anyone would ever see it," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was unfiltered, not shaped for the situation, just real. Eleanor gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged both the statement and the meaning behind it, and then she stepped just a little closer, closing the space between them until it felt personal, immediate, undeniable. "That is when it matters most," she said quietly, and the truth of it did not need emphasis, did not need repetition, because it had already been proven in the simplest way possible. Behind her, the officer stood still, his gaze steady, his presence no longer guiding the moment but supporting it, and after a brief pause, he raised his hand slightly, a subtle signal, and the Marines behind him responded with precision, not breaking formation, but shifting into a posture that felt different, less rigid, more ceremonial, as if the purpose of their presence had transitioned fully from arrival to acknowledgement. Ethan noticed it, the synchronized movement, the quiet discipline, and for a second, he felt a sense of weight in the moment that he could not fully describe, not pressure, not expectation, but something closer to significance. Eleanor turned slightly, her eyes moving briefly to the officer, and then back to Ethan, and without saying anything further, she extended her hand, not as a formality, not as a gesture of status, but as something simple, something human. Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before reaching out, his hand meeting hers, her grip firm but warm, steady in a way that matched everything about her. The contact was brief, but it carried meaning, not spoken, not explained, just understood. When she released his hand, she gave him one last look, her expression calm, settled, and then she stepped back, returning to stand beside the officer, her presence once again aligned with the world she had come from, but not separated from the one she had just experienced. The street remained quiet, the neighbors still watching, the Marines standing in disciplined stillness, but the tension that had filled the air at the beginning was gone completely, replaced by something else, something that did not need to be named to be felt. And as Ethan stood there on his front steps, he realized that nothing about his life had changed in a visible way, and yet everything about this moment had shifted how it would be. Remembered, not as something extraordinary that happened to him, but as something simple that had revealed something true. The moment did not end with a command or a signal. It faded, slowly and naturally, like the last note of a song that did not need to be repeated, and Ethan stood there as the weight of everything settled into something quieter, something that no longer demanded attention but would not be forgotten. Eleanor Hayes turned slightly toward the officer, her posture composed, her expression calm, and without a word, he gave a subtle nod, the kind that required no instruction, and behind them, the Marines shifted once more, this time not to form or to hold, but to conclude, their movements precise but softer now, like a presence that had fulfilled its purpose. One by one, they stepped back into alignment with the vehicles, their boots making only the faintest sound against the pavement, the discipline still there, but no longer carrying tension, only closure. The engine started again, low and controlled, filling the quiet street with a steady hum that did not interrupt the moment so much as carry it forward. Ethan watched as Eleanor paused one last time before stepping toward the vehicle, her hand resting briefly on the door, and then she looked back at him, not with distance, not with farewell, but with recognition. The kind that did not need repetition, "Do not change," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying clearly across the short space between them, and the words did not feel like advice. They felt like something closer to trust, something given rather than asked. Ethan nodded slowly, his throat tightening just slightly, not from emotion he could not control, but from the quiet realization that this moment, as simple as it had been, would stay with him far longer than anything else. "I will not," he replied, his voice firm, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. She held his gaze for one more second, just long enough to make it real, and then she stepped into the vehicle, the door closing gently behind her, not with finality, but with a sense of completion. The officer followed, pausing only briefly to look back at Ethan, his expression composed, respectful, and without a word, he gave a small nod, one that carried acknowledgement rather than authority, before stepping inside as well. The vehicles began to move, slowly at first, then with quiet purpose, pulling away from the curb one by one. The Marines already seated, their presence receding not with spectacle, but with the same controlled calm they had arrived with. The neighbors remained still as the convoy passed, their phones lowered now, their voices absent, as if they understood that what they had witnessed was not meant to be explained in loud conversation, but remembered in quiet reflection. Within moments, the street returned to what it had always been: modest houses, uneven sidewalks, the faint rustle of trees in the breeze. But something had changed, not in the way it looked, but in the way it felt. Ethan stood alone on his front steps again, his hands at his sides, the paper in his pocket, the memory still fresh, and for a long second, he did nothing. He just breathed, steady, grounded, present. Then, almost instinctively, his gaze drifted down the street, toward where the bus stop would be, toward the corner of Maple and 3rd. And though it was empty now, though the bench sat alone beneath the streetlight, it no longer felt forgotten. He took a small step forward, then another, not because anything was expected of him, not because anyone was watching, but because that was what he had always done. And as he walked, the quiet truth of the moment stayed with him, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that would not fade. A simple understanding that kindness, when given without reason, without expectation, had the power to be seen in ways no one could predict, and that sometimes the smallest actions were enough to remind the world of what it meant to be human.